Operation Barbarossa, the invasion that broke Hitler's Reich. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. What followed would become the largest military operation in human history, and Adolf Hitler's greatest miscalculation. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just an invasion, it was a gamble that would determine the fate of the world, and within 6 months, the unstoppable Wehrmacht would find itself frozen in the Russian winter, staring at the gates of Moscow with frostbitten fingers and empty fuel tanks. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Hitler had actually signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin just 2 years earlier. The two totalitarian giants had carved up Eastern Europe together, like mobsters dividing territory. So what changed? And why did the man who had conquered France in 6 weeks believe he could defeat the Soviet Union in just 4 months? The pact that nobody believed. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 shocked the world. Communists and fascists, sworn ideological enemies, suddenly became partners. Stalin got Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and breathing room. Hitler got a free hand in the West and crucial Soviet resources, oil, grain, and raw materials that fueled his war machine. For nearly 2 years, trainloads of Soviet wheat and petroleum rolled into Germany, while Stalin willfully ignored every warning about what was coming next. And the warnings were everywhere. British intelligence passed them along. Soviet spies in Germany sent desperate messages. Even a German deserter crossed the lines on the eve of the invasion to warn Soviet border guards. Stalin dismissed them all as British provocations designed to drive a wedge between him and Hitler. In one of history's most catastrophic failures of intelligence assessment, Stalin trusted Hitler more than his own agents. When the invasion began, Soviet forces were so unprepared that German soldiers found Soviet planes lined up on airfields in neat rows, destroyed before they could even take off. The plan? Hubris meets strategy. Operation Barbarossa was born from Hitler's twisted ideology and what seemed like rational strategic thinking. Hitler believed the Soviet Union was a house of cards, held together by Jewish Bolshevik leadership and populated by Slavic Untermenschen, subhumans who would collapse at the first German blow. He needed Soviet resources, particularly oil from the Caucasus, to continue his war against Britain. And he believed, incorrectly, fatally, that defeating the Soviet Union would force Britain to negotiate, leaving Germany master of Europe. The German plan called for 3 massive army groups to drive deep into Soviet territory. Army Group North would take Leningrad. Army Group South would capture Ukraine and drive toward the oil fields. Army Group Center, the strongest, would smash through Belarus toward Moscow. The entire campaign was supposed to be over before winter. After all, hadn't Germany defeated France in weeks? What chance did the disorganized Soviets have? Here's the problem. Russia isn't France. The distances were staggering. From the German-Soviet border to Moscow was roughly 600 miles. But it wasn't 600 miles of French highways and railways. It was primitive roads that turned to impassable mud with every rain, railroad tracks of different gauges that required constant conversion, and vast forests and swamps where armored divisions could barely maneuver. The Germans were planning a mechanized blitzkrieg in a country where horses would prove more reliable than trucks. The first months, when everything seemed possible. Initially, Barbarossa looked like Hitler's prophecy fulfilled. Soviet forces were caught completely off guard. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. In the first week, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 4,000 Soviet aircraft. By September, German armies had advanced hundreds of miles, captured millions of prisoners, and seemed unstoppable. In the encirclement at Kiev alone, the Germans captured 665,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest encirclement in military history. Wehrmacht soldiers sent letters home describing a highway of victory. Newsreels showed endless columns of dejected Soviet prisoners. German officers began calculating how they'd divide up their conquests after victory. Moscow seemed within grasp. By October, German reconnaissance units could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But something strange was happening. Soviet resistance wasn't collapsing, it was hardening. Every defensive line destroyed, another formed behind it. Every army surrounded, another materialized to take its place. The house of cards wasn't falling, it was revealing itself to be built of sterner stuff than Hitler had imagined. Stalin gave his infamous Order Number 227, not one step back. Desertion meant execution. Cities would be defended to the last building. The turning point. General Winter takes command. As autumn arrived, the German advance began to slow. The first rains turned roads to rivers of mud, the infamous Rasputitsa, immobilizing German mechanized units. Tanks bogged down. Supply trucks couldn't reach frontline units. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms, watched the first snow fall in October with growing dread. Here's where the German plan unraveled completely. Hitler had been so confident of quick victory that he hadn't equipped his soldiers for winter warfare. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance at every point was far fiercer than anticipated. At Moscow, Soviet forces launched fierce counterattacks. Fresh Siberian divisions, troops accustomed to cold, equipped for winter, began arriving from the east after Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees. German weapons froze. Engine oil became solid. Frostbite decimated German units as surely as Soviet bullets. One German soldier wrote home, "We're not fighting the Russians, we're fighting the cold." Horses died by the thousands. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point and beyond. The magnificent Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe, found itself starving and freezing just miles from Moscow. The cost beyond calculation. On December 5, 1941, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive around Moscow, driving German armies back 150 miles. It was Germany's first major defeat of the war. But calling it a defeat hardly captures what Barbarossa meant for both nations. This wasn't a battle. It was mutual annihilation on a scale humanity had never witnessed. The Soviets lost approximately 5 million soldiers in 1941 alone, killed, captured, or missing. Entire armies ceased to exist. But they didn't surrender. German losses, though smaller, were irreplaceable. By December, the Wehrmacht had suffered 830,000 casualties, more than they'd lost in all previous campaigns combined. More importantly, they'd lost the initiative, the myth of invincibility, and any realistic hope of defeating the Soviet Union. Behind the military statistics lay something even darker. Barbarossa wasn't just a military operation, it was an ideological war of annihilation. Hitler's Kommissarbefehl ordered the execution of Soviet political officers. The Hunger Plan deliberately aimed to starve millions of Soviet civilians. Einsatzgruppen death squads followed the army, murdering Jews, communists, and partisans. This was warfare stripped of any pretense of civilization. Why Barbarossa matters today. Operation Barbarossa changed everything. The German failure to defeat the Soviet Union in 1941 meant the war would continue for 4 more years, ultimately leading to Nazi Germany's complete destruction. It opened the Eastern Front, the war's bloodiest theater, where perhaps 80% of all German military casualties would occur. It transformed the Soviet Union from a pariah state into a crucial Allied power, and it began a German-Soviet struggle that would kill over 25 million Soviet citizens and end with the red flag flying over the Reichstag. But here's what haunts historians. It almost worked. If Hitler had concentrated on Moscow instead of diverting forces south to Ukraine in September, might German armies have captured the Soviet capital before winter? If Stalin had heeded warnings and prepared his forces, could the initial catastrophe have been prevented? If Hitler had treated Soviet civilians as liberators instead of subhumans, might millions have welcomed German armies as liberation from Stalinist terror? History doesn't deal in alternative outcomes, but Barbarossa reminds us that even the most terrible certainties began as contingencies. The operation that seemed unstoppable in June was shattered by December. The dictator who appeared invincible revealed himself as a gambler who'd bet everything on a fantasy, and the country that seemed on the verge of collapse would instead push all the way to Berlin, reshaping the world order for the next half-century. Today, when we look at the vast war cemeteries stretching across Eastern Europe, at the monuments to the siege of Leningrad or the Battle of Stalingrad that would follow, we're looking at the consequences of Operation Barbarossa. It remains the largest land battle ever fought, the deadliest military operation in history, and the beginning of the end for Hitler's thousand-year Reich. The invasion that was supposed to last 4 months took 4 years to resolve, and it resolved in a bunker in Berlin, where Hitler took his own life as Soviet shells rained down above. Barbarossa didn't just fail, it destroyed everything Hitler had built and cost tens of millions of lives in the process. That's not just history, that's a warning that echoes across generations.